once again, welcome to Scholars in a Bar. It's the humanities with drinks, and today our guest is Dr. John Fitzmorris, who is professor of history at the University of New Orleans, and also serving temporarily, at least, as an adjunct at the University of the Holy Cross in New Orleans. And our favorite drink today for me is scotch, and for Dr. Fitzmorris, it's bourbon. So it's a bourbon and scotch day today. So let's get started, because Dr. Fitzmorris's field is history, and specifically military history. And he has done some very interesting research in the area that covers the Vietnam War. And his specialty there is on the chaplaincy corps during the Vietnam War. So let's get started with a question to Dr. Fitzmorris. Hi, John. Welcome to Scholars in a Bar.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Dr. Eichmann. Excuse me.
Okay, let's just, Al and John, okay?
Good enough, Al.
Okay. Welcome to Scholars in a Bar, and the question I have for you, well, first of all, is why is it important to study about the chaplaincy corps during the Vietnam War?
Well, it's important for a number of reasons, and first and foremost is that the soldiers that go into war do not necessarily leave their religion and their faith back at home, put them in their duffel bags and put them away. They bring God with them into the field, or they hope that God will be with them in the field. And so on a personal level, for each individual soldier, to have a sense that God is going to protect them and guide them through just completely awful conditions is very important to them on the personal level. Then, of course, there's the larger picture, and that is that this nation has had a long history of interaction with religion, despite our separation of religion and state. How would I put it? The allowances made for religious organizations and faith to work among the soldiers in our military has been a part of the American fabric for a long, long time, dating all the way back to the Revolutionary War, in which chaplains were active during that. So you see the larger picture of religion in America, but you also see the smaller picture of the individual soldier and his need to feel connected to the divine, especially in a place where the divine doesn't seem all that evident.
Yeah, that really says a lot, but also, I think, talking about the First Amendment issues, a lot of people don't understand this, that there is a separation of church and state, but the main purpose of the First Amendment was not so much, well, it was to separate church and state, but it had a purpose. And the purpose was to encourage and not prohibit the free exercise of religion.
That's correct.
And since there has to be total control in a military setting, the only way that you can encourage the free exercise of religion is to build religion into the military structure in some way, but do it in such a way that all options are on the table. And I think that is why we have had a chaplaincy corps, continue to have a chaplaincy corps, and probably will have a chaplaincy corps going forward.
Yes, and there have been challenges to the chaplaincy corps by those who adhere very strongly to the First Amendment and believe to have religion exercised completely from all functions of our civil society. At the same time, the chaplain corps has tread a very fine line at times because of this, because they are very careful to understand that they are there to serve the spiritual needs of the troops that are in combat or in the military, while also adhering to military standards and protocol, and in addition to that, making sure that they are not there to proselytize and to gather more members to their faith, but instead simply meet the soldier where he is at that particular moment in his religious life.
So if you're a Christian chaplain and you're serving a Muslim soldier, it's important for you to find a way to serve that soldier. That might involve you reaching out to either another chaplain who happens to be Muslim, or finding a Muslim imam in the community that can serve that soldier's need. Is that correct?
That's correct. In fact, as the history goes, a Vietnam chaplain by the name of John O'Connor, who later became the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, was responsible for having the first Muslim service on a U.S. Army base for the Muslim soldiers to allow for the practice of Islam on the base.
People need to really understand that about the chaplaincy corps, and I think there's just a lot of confusion and misunderstanding.
Oftentimes what we get is the image of Father Mulcahy from MASH, who's sort of well-meaning but out of the way, and oftentimes in the way, trying to find a usefulness for himself in the series, or asking, "Excuse me, are any of you folks Catholic?" And "Father, back off, please. We're busy doing something else." When in truth, a chaplain is there for more than just spiritual counseling and spiritual needs and sacramental needs. He's there as an emotional counselor. He's there as an emotional grounding for troops. He's there to provide a steady voice in times of combat. And he is there to say, if a individual wants to adopt a religion or convert to a religion, to say, then my job is to help make that possible for you, whatever my religion may be. Your religion is important to you. And so chaplains come from denominations, and they maintain their denomination, but at the same time, if you're a Mormon chaplain and you minister to Catholics, you minister to them as Catholics. You don't minister to them as Mormons, and vice versa.
In religious studies, we have a term for that. It's called a pluralistic religious structure.
That's correct. And it makes the military sort of on the cutting edge of another term we like to use called ecumenism, and that all religions are welcome, all religions are valued. Whatever your particular religion may be as a chaplain, you value the religion of that soldier at that particular time, you accept it. So the military is on the forefront of that.
Well, a lot of university chaplaincies have had to do the very same thing and are doing the very same thing. Matter of fact, I think most of the credible universities where they still have a chaplain, which is private schools, still do that or are doing that. They'll have all sorts of different chaplains on staff if it's a large enough and wealthy enough school, and from all sorts of different traditions. And they might even have an atheistic humanist chaplain. I just read recently where Harvard has its first head atheistic humanist chaplain as the head of the chaplaincy corps. But of course it has Muslim chaplains and Christian chaplains and Jewish, and a whole group of chaplains, not just the one. So that's a model that we see increasingly in our pluralistic society. Okay, let's get a little bit more focused on Vietnam.
Sure.
Because I know that in your research, you just weren't a book scholar on this, were you? You just didn't go to the library at USM where you got your PhD and hang out there. You did a lot more than that in terms of...
Yes. In order to explain or answer that question as fully as possible, I need to go back somewhat to the beginning. And that is when I was a graduate student at USM and I was preparing myself to become a scholar of the Second World War, when I took a class on the Vietnam War, after which the professor said, "You need to go to Vietnam." And I said, "Well, how do I do that?" He says, "We will take care of that for you, but you're going to go to Vietnam this summer, and I want you to do that." Very much the same way that you were being told you were going someplace. And only in this case, I said yes. And before I knew it, I was on a plane to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City now today, and I spent 23 of the most life-changing days that I ever had in the country of Vietnam. Where I went to Saigon, I went to Hue City in the center of Vietnam, Da Nang, I went to Hanoi, Hai Phong, visited hospitals, met with veterans, Vietnamese veterans, in their meeting halls, very akin to like American Legion halls, with looks all exactly the same except for the big statue of Ho Chi Minh, looking like Abraham Lincoln on the pedestal. I stood in the exact same spot where my uncle and godfather was wounded as a U.S. Marine on the roof of the old university building in Way, which was an incredibly powerful, emotional moment. And in the process of reading about the Battle of Hawaii, I came across a Jesuit chaplain by the name of Aloysius McGonigal, who was shot dead during the Tet Offensive in Way. And in looking into his story, I realized that I had the genesis of my dissertation topic was to focus on chaplains in Vietnam, but specifically chaplains who served in combat zones during the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And from that point onward, I was developing my dissertation topic, and rather than just simply go into a library and hang out and look at memoirs and so forth, which I certainly did, I wanted to get in touch with them personally. And so I began to write to them and arrange meetings with them. And I went to places like Dublin, Georgia, and Fayetteville, North Carolina, where Fort Bragg is, and California, and Memphis, Tennessee. And I sat down with these chaplains personally, and I spoke with them, and I befriended them and learned from them and got to know these people. And in a sense, it became more than just a project. It was actually more of a project to make new friends than it was even a project for my dissertation, which was very important about it. Mm-hmm. And so I got to know these men very intimately, broke bread with them, met their wives, met their families, learned their stories. I met with Catholic priests, I met with a Mormon chaplain, a Baptist chaplain, actually several Baptist chaplains along the way, and another one from the Disciples of Christ. And literally have maintained correspondence with them throughout this whole project that resulted in my dissertation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the experience you had of USM basically sending you to Vietnam.
Yes.
And being on the faculty at USM, one of the things I am very much aware of is that we really do encourage our students to have foreign experiences, and we do send our students actually all over the world. And it's one of the things that I think is very important, not only for University of Southern Mississippi, but for, every university should be engaged in this process, because like you said, for you, it was eye-opening.
Yes.
And it changed the entire direction that you were going in terms of your dissertation.
I got to hold and hug babies who were born to parents who were affected by Agent Orange, that had all sorts of disabilities, grotesque disfigurements. There's nothing more powerful than holding a little baby that is in a hospital that's being taken care of like that, and knowing and comprehending the fact that it was our nation that created the circumstances that produced a child such as this. That was part of the eye-opening aspects, or watching maimed civilians from Vietnam, missing arms or fingers or feet or something, making beautiful lacquer wall hangings and ornaments and so forth, and watching them just simply, this is what happened to me, and I'm going to deal with it as best as I can. That was an amazing thing for me. And of course, standing in the exact spot where my uncle caught 5 shots in the back while he was rescuing Marines off the roof of a building was just was a powerful, powerful story.
Wow, to say the least.
Yes.
Wow. So tell me about some of the encounters you had in this country with chaplains who were Vietnam veterans.
One of whom that I really became close to was a gentleman by the name of Ed Wallen, who was a Catholic priest chaplain. He was from Memphis, Tennessee. He was something of a agitator in the eyes of some, condemned by the John Birch Society because of his civil rights activity at Memphis State University. Went to Vietnam, served, was wounded in combat, came home, joined the Berrigan brothers in their anti-war protesting, was a frequently visited by the FBI at his apartment, then later left the priesthood and married a nun, and joined a veteran support group. And then up until his passing about 2 years ago, he was active in the VA, helping soldiers reacclimate, helping them simply get to the VA. Another gentleman by the name of Jack Johnson, who lives in Dublin, Georgia. He still quite alive, a Baptist preacher who he drives a golf cart at the VA, bringing soldiers to get their treatment. But from car to the VA, he runs like a little private ministry on his own of really not so much giving religious ministry, but giving counseling ministry and saying, I was in Vietnam and I'm going through some of the things that you're going through, like post-traumatic stress, and essentially making it easier for soldiers to walk into the VA, which was not always the easiest thing in the world for a long time, for soldiers to seek help from the VA. Fortunately for us today, with the conditions that the VA has now, especially here in New Orleans, it's much easier for soldiers to go in and get the treatment and receive the services that they are due by our country.
Yeah, we probably have one of the premier VA facilities in the country.
Yes,
here in New Orleans.
Without a doubt. It is. I call it your tax dollars put to good, excellent use, and that's what the VA here is in New Orleans. I wanted to talk about the third chaplain, and he lives in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and he wrote a wonderful memoir. He was a Baptist chaplain, very devout man, had no hatred or bitterness in his soul except for one person, Jane Fonda. He couldn't stand Jane Fonda, and I said, well, I can forgive him for that. There's plenty of reasons why that's the case for many a Vietnam veteran. But I sat there with him over a 3-day period in 2013. Early February 2013, and for 3 days I talked with him and stayed with him and his family and got to see just what a really good human being this was, but indeed a human being, someone who happened to be religious and endured the worst of combat because he decided he was going to put on his pack and go out in the field with his men.
Which is what an authentic chaplain would do.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm sure not all of them did, however.
No, not all of them. There were some chaplains that engaged in what was known to many soldiers as chaplain bullshit. They were safely ensconced on bases behind the lines, or out of the combat zone, I should say, in Vietnam. And when a soldier had a problem with killing, which many of them did, oftentimes these chaplains say, you're keeping the world safe from communism. You've got to go and do what you have to do, which was the last thing these soldiers wanted to hear. But a wonderful chaplain named Bill Mahidi, who was an Episcopalian chaplain, said, I don't know the answer to that question, why we have to be killing. I don't know what the answer is, but you know what? I'm with you here. Let's examine it together as two individuals in the field. And that probably is the most important role that a chaplain played for soldiers, is to let the soldier know he's not alone in the field. Yeah. Even though you rely on buddies and you're part of a unit, when you have taken a life, that's a bridge from which you can't cross back over, and it changes you forever. The chaplain's there to let the soldier know, I'm with you here, we're going to walk through this together, and we'll help you get through this in the end.
During this particular period of time that you're talking about, I was in first college, undergraduate school, then in seminary, and then I was in the pastoral ministry. And I was aware that there were groups out there, as like one that I was a part of, called Clergy and Laity Concerned. And clergy and laity concerned were those of us who were either ordained ministers or lay people who were in opposition to the Vietnam War on ethical grounds, on what we consider to be solid moral grounds. Did you find any chaplains that shared that position, who were actually in the military, serving in Vietnam, who at the same time were really against the war itself? You named the one man who came back and allied himself with the Berrigan brothers. Were there others, and was this common?
There were other chaplains who certainly had their questions about the moral the moral efficacy of the war, if that's the word we want to use, or the moral righteousness of the war. And they were not ashamed to express that, but understanding that they were men of the military, they had to adhere to certain protocols. But at the same time, they said, my position on the war is not that important as it is to be with the men. So the ministry to the men was more important than their political feelings about the war. Now, once they got home, as I pointed out with Chaplain Ed Wallen, then they could engage in things like Pax Christi and other
There were a whole
anti-war
bunch of different anti-war.
Right.
They were religiously based.
Right. And then you had some that really went to extreme lengths, one of whom was a fellow by the name of Charles Littke, who was actually awarded the Medal of Honor. He's one of 3 chaplains to have been awarded the Medal of Honor in Vietnam for rescuing men in the field of fire, who then came home and became an avid anti-war protester to the point where he actually turned his Medal of Honor in at the Vietnam Wall, and then became very much in the line of the Berrigan brothers, spent a great deal of time in federal prison, and also married a nun, left the priesthood, and he just recently passed away too, but he was a constant guest of the federal government for his anti-war protestations.
Well, I remember I was, at that time, chair of the Social Justice Committee for the association of my denomination. And it was a big association because it was Chicago Metro. And I remember we'd have these meetings and I would open by saying, and if there's any members of the FBI present, welcome. We hope you learned something from this process.
Yes. There were plenty of agents looking about, visiting some of these former chaplains and their comrades in the anti-war movement. But for the most part, what these chaplains did, and those that became anti-war activists, were in their minds and in their hearts, and in my belief, exercising a ministry. There were others who simply turned and helped create situations for veterans coming home to deal with the post-traumatic stress that they were dealing with after the war. And so many of these chaplains would go to the VA and they'd say, for instance, a soldier coming home from Vietnam who's 19 years old and he's just done a tour in Vietnam. And a 19-year-old is at the most formative point in his life. And he has now witnessed the equivalent of 70 train wrecks in a one-year period. He is traumatized by this. He doesn't trust a lot of people. And you want him to just come into this big old VA and be treated. He's not going to do it. Instead, what we need to do is have smaller groups in other places where they can sit around and have what we'll call rap sessions, which is the forerunner of the support groups that we have today, in which they could sit in a place and have coffee, almost like a recovery group like AA or
it was recovery.
Yeah, and it was indeed a recovery group, and they could sit around, have coffee, and talk about their experiences, and from that point, then they can be guided into the VA for the pharmacological treatments that some of them needed, the deeper psychological treatments that some of them needed. And so these chaplains, in many ways, they suffered post-traumatic stress, but they're a little bit older, they're better educated, so intellectually they understand what's going on with themselves emotionally. The 19-year-old or the 20-year-old coming home has no intellectual concept of what's going on and does not know how to deal with it. So there's the chaplain there saying, look, I walked with you in the field, now I'm going to walk with you in peacetime, and I'm going to help bring you into this. And so many of these chaplains created groups. And for instance, my chaplain in North Carolina, James Johnson is his name, he started rap groups.
It's starting to make me feel guilty. And I'll tell you why. I was anti-war, and so that's what my focus was during this particular period as a clergy person. I'm starting to feel like perhaps I should have gone into the fray and had the courage that these guys had in terms of what they were doing, which your description is so moving. so moving.
Well, I don't want you to feel guilty because this was a very difficult time in which people felt they had to make certain moral choices. For the 19 to 20-year-old who's the draftee, there's no choice. You go to war, you go to jail, or you go to Canada. And you didn't have a choice beyond that. These men chose, whether they agreed with the war or not, to go out there and to labor in the field for the men and share the privations. Others felt it was their duty to stay at home and agitate at home against what they felt was an unjust and immoral war. And I'm not here to cast judgment on anybody who did one way or the other. I'm here to simply say the story of the chaplain is a story that needs to be told.
Yeah, it really does. And can you give us can you pick out one very moving, like battlefield instance of a chaplain's experience during this particular period of time that has stuck with you? Could you do that? Would you care to do that?
Just one is a very difficult thing, and so I won't do just one. I'll give you a couple. Of the three men to have been awarded the Medal of Honor who were chaplains, two of them were awarded it posthumously. And Charlie Litke, who went by the name Angelo at the time, he was awarded the Medal of Honor and survived the war. The first one was Father Vincent Capodanno, who was a Maryknoll missionary and who felt like he was languishing and not doing his best in Taiwan, ministering to the natives in Taiwan. And so he applied to become a chaplain in the U.S. Navy. And Chaplain Capodanno, in 1967, was shot and killed by a hail of gunfire while pulling men off the field. The same can go for another chaplain named Charles Waters, who was a secular priest, a non-religious order priest. And he too was ministering to men in a hot zone at an aid station when of all things, friendly fire came in and destroyed the aid station and killed everybody, including himself. And he had been told several times, "You need to get out of here, Padre, you need to get out of here." And he said, "No, this is where the men need me the most." And so he was killed and was awarded the Medal of Honor as well. There were other types of stories that moved me. Chaplain Jerry Autry, who was a Baptist chaplain, was another one who wrote his own memoir, but then whom I got to speak to in California. He was nicknamed the gun-toting chaplain, which he regretted later because he was photographed having picked up a weapon. And chaplains aren't exactly supposed to be carrying a weapon. But during a particular battle, because he had had experience in the military before, he helped the men guide fire on a position so that he could save other men. And so there's a moral choice right there. Now, here I am, a chaplain who is ministering to these men. I'm supposed to be a man of peace, and yet I'm guiding fire, but it's because I want to save the men that are under my care. That is probably the most emotional. I mean, to give your life in the field, there's nothing higher than that. I get that. But to actually make the choice to fire on a position where you might kill somebody and you're supposed to be a man of the cloth, but you're doing it to save other lives, that's an incredible decision that a 20-something-year-old man has to make. Because these guys were in their mid-20s at best. Many of them are fresh out of seminary or divinity school. And they're there and they're faced with making moral choices. The last story I'll tell is Jim Johnson, again, my friend in Fayetteville, North Carolina, who I love him deeply, related the story of how his soldiers were marching past a corpse of a Vietnamese, a Viet Cong soldier who was riddled with bullet holes. And the troops all had their plastic spoons from where they were eating. And so they all took their plastic spoons and put a spoon into each of the holes in this now putrefying corpse. And I said, "Chaplain, what was your reaction to that?" And I never cast judgment on anything. And he says, "Part of me was disgusted by this, and another part of me said, this was the men decompressing from war, and it wasn't for me at that particular time to give them a stern lecture or anything like that. I was just there to help them with it afterwards," which And that's what he did.
Yeah.